Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk about two more fallacies, the DA, or denying the antecedent, and NS, or non sequitur fallacies. So, here's an argument. If Sally lives in Torrance, Sally lives in the South Bay. Sally doesn't live in Torrance, so Sally doesn't live in the South Bay. So we have a conditional, the denial of the antecedent, and we infer to the denial of the consequent. So is this argument valid? That is the case that no matter what, that the conclusion is true if the premises are. The conclusion is true in any situation in which the premises are. Is that the case or not? Well, the premises and conclusion could all be true. Sally could live in New York City, and so she doesn't live in Torrance, and she doesn't live in the South Bay, and so the second premise and conclusion are true, and certainly the first premise is true. If Sally lives in Torrance, she lives in the South Bay. But that's not enough for the argument to be valid. We have to ask, is it the case that no matter what, if the premises are true, the conclusion is? Well, suppose Sally lives in Redondo Beach. Then the second premise is true, she doesn't live in Torrance. And the first premise is true, if she lives in Torrance, she lives in the South Bay, but the conclusion is false. Redondo Beach is in the South Bay, so Sally lives in the South Bay. And then the premises are true, and the conclusion is false. And so this argument is again invalid. And that means the argument is a fallacy. It looks like if you draw it, you're thinking it's valid, but it's not, and that makes the argument a fallacy. So the form of this argument is we have a conditional, if antecedent, then consequent. The other premise is the denial of the antecedent, the negation of the antecedent, and the conclusion is not consequent. So if we were to formalize this, we would have if P then Q, not antecedent is negation P, and negation consequent is negation Q. So we call this denying the antecedent because that's what the second premise is. This is another fallacious rule in addition to affirming the consequent, and we call this bad DA for denying the antecedent. So we can compare this with modus tollens, which is if P then Q, not Q, then not P. And again, as with when we looked at the bad AC rule and compared it with MP, the only difference was that the second premise and the conclusion were flipped, and the same thing is happening here. In the good rule, we have the second premise is the negation of the consequent. In the bad rule, it's the negation of the antecedent, and in the good rule, the conclusion is the negation of the antecedent. In the bad rule, it's the negation of the consequent, and so we've just reversed the order of the second premise and the conclusion. And so again, it's a small difference, but it's also a very important difference. It makes the modus tollens is a valid rule, bad DA is not a valid rule. Here's another example of AC. For another example of DA, we have if he's a murderer, he's dangerous. He's not a murderer, therefore he's not dangerous. This is invalid. You can be dangerous without being a murderer, and there's just the premises can be true and the conclusion false. A conditional that has a false antecedent can still have a true consequent. The fact that he's not a murderer, the first conditional says, hey, I'm not saying the only way to be dangerous is to be a murderer. I'm saying one way to be dangerous is to be a murderer. And so just because someone isn't dangerous in the way that I say, that doesn't mean he's not dangerous in other ways. So this is an invalid argument. Okay, briefly, the non sequitur fallacy. This one's easy. Here's an example. If Sandra lives in Torrance, she lives in the South Bay. Sandra lives in Torrance, therefore the Earth is a sphere. The conclusion doesn't follow in any way. Maybe Sandra does live in Torrance, and certainly if she lives in Torrance, she lives in the South Bay. And in fact, the Earth is a sphere, more or less, but there's just no relationship between the premises and the conclusion. It's very easy for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Just change the shape of the Earth a little bit, and Sandra can still live in Torrance, and Torrance still be in the South Bay. So this is just, the conclusion is simply comes out of nowhere. It doesn't follow in any way. So non sequitur is just Latin for doesn't follow. So when we have an argument where the conclusion simply comes out of nowhere, it doesn't have any relationship to the premises at all, we say it's a non sequitur fallacy. We say it's bad/NS for non sequitur. In the next video, we'll look at some arguments and practice applying these fallacies and saying, aha, here's a derivation, and here's where the fallacy, here's an attempt at a derivation, but it's a fallacious, and here's where the fallacy is. So that's what we'll do in the next video, and you'll be doing some of that for your homework too, so you'll want to watch that video.